I grew up in the desert, the kind of wide and empty land where the silence hangs heavy and the wind carries dust across dry canyons like waves on an ocean. Camping and off-roading out there was more than just a hobby for my family. It was part of how we lived. My grandparents had owned a ranch in the middle of nowhere. No neighbors for miles, no quick help if something went wrong. My parents took it over after them, and from as far back as I can remember, we were all raised on the idea that family meant protection. The police wouldn't get there in time, maybe not even at all, so we were taught from a young age to rely on ourselves. Guns were not some distant, forbidden thing in our family. They were tools we were taught to respect, to handle carefully, and if need be, to use to defend our own. One summer, we decided to gather almost the whole family for a trip into one of the desert canyons where target practice was allowed. Those places were remote and completely enclosed by mountains. When you stood at the bottom of those rocky walls, you could feel how isolated it was. You knew that once you drove in, you had to drive back out the same way. No shortcuts, no back exits. That sense of enclosure made it perfect for shooting because the sound echoed but didn't carry out, but it also meant you were boxed in. There's only one way in and one way out. We set up camp early in the morning. The sun hadn't reached its peak yet, so the air was still cool, though the sand already radiated heat under our boots. There were about 15 adults in total, plus all the kids. We spread out 2 long folding tables and laid the rifles, shotguns, and handguns across them. Between all of us, there was more than enough to go around, and throughout the day we swapped and tried each other's weapons. The crack of gunfire echoed off the canyon walls on and off as the hours passed. Not constant but steady, as people rotated between eating, talking, and shooting. It was a normal day for us, one of those family gatherings where everyone's comfort in the setting made the desert feel like home instead of some lonely wasteland. By late afternoon, the air had grown heavy with heat. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the dust we kicked up, and every sound seemed amplified by the stone walls. Kids ran around near the trucks when they weren't practicing with small-caliber rifles under close supervision, and the adults lounged in camping chairs, talking in low voices about ranch work, old memories, and plans for later in the summer. That's when the trucks appeared. 2 of them, pulling in side by side, wide and slow. The canyon had only one entrance, and the way they came in blocked our path out. At first, it looked like any other group of guys who might be coming in for target practice like us, but the way they parked said something else. They didn't angle off to find their own spot. They parked square, nose to nose with the only exit. Engines still rumbling. Both trucks sat for a long moment before doors opened. 4 men stepped out of each truck. A total. Every one of them had a gun hanging from a strap on their shoulder. They weren't holding them ready, but they weren't hidden either. The air shifted instantly. The laughter and conversation among our family cut off. The kids quieted. Even the echo of their engines fading seemed to disappear into a silence that pressed against my ears. Without a word, every one of us moved. The lessons drilled into us over years kicked in like muscle memory. Hands reached for weapons. Those standing near the tables picked them up. Rifles were shouldered. Shotguns rested firmly in grip. Handguns hung pointed low at the dirt but ready. Even the youngest ones who had been trained for this tucked themselves behind the trucks, but not empty-handed. I saw cousins as young as 9 step behind the bed of a truck, rifles steadied across the metal, their small bodies hidden except for determined eyes fixed forward. The adults formed a line without needing to speak. My uncle stood tall at the front, my father just beside him. My mother, who usually leaned on canes to get around, tossed them aside and accepted a rifle into her arms as though the weight steadied her better than any support. The sound of metal on metal, the click of safeties being switched off, carried across the space louder than the men probably expected. From where I stood, my chest tight and my eyes locked on the men, I could see the change in them. They had walked out of their trucks with shoulders loose, maybe even a bit cocky, but now their faces shifted. One of them froze in place. Another's hand twitched at his strap like he couldn't decide if lifting his weapon would be smarter or the worst mistake he could make. Their heads turned quickly to each other, silent looks passing, their confidence draining as they realized they hadn't rolled up on some unarmed family picnic. They had walked into something else entirely. The silence between us stretched. My grip tightened on the rifle, the barrel steady though my heartbeat was anything but calm. You could feel the weight of decision hanging in the air, heavier than the heat of the desert sun. Then, without warning, they broke. One after another, scrambling almost in sync, they turned and retreated back to their trucks. Doors slammed, engines roared. I caught sight of one man's pale face as he ducked into the passenger seat, his eyes wide like a cornered animal. The trucks shifted into reverse, tires spitting sand, and within seconds they were pulling out the way they had come in, dust rising in their wake. As they left, one of them leaned his head out the window long enough to throw back a hurried apology, though the words were weak, almost swallowed by the sound of the engine. They were gone in seconds, swallowed back down the canyon road. The silence held for a long moment after, none of us lowering our weapons until the sound of the engines had fully faded. Slowly, the rifles lowered, the safeties clicked back on. The kids came out from behind the trucks. My mother bent down and retrieved her canes, her hands steady though her face showed the same tension I knew I felt. We didn't just sit back down as though nothing happened. My brother and uncle climbed onto quads without hesitation. They knew those canyons better than anyone, knew every trail and drop point. They didn't have to follow close to know exactly where the trucks would end up. They sped off, dust rising behind them, while the rest of us stayed put, cleaning up the tables, packing things into trucks with hands that moved quickly but with glances cast toward the entrance again and again. By the time my brother called, they had reached the main road and gotten cell service. He and my uncle had already phoned the police, giving details of the trucks, the men, and their weapons. We waited, tense but calmer now, as news filtered back through. The police found them within 10 minutes. Not even far, just at a gas station down the highway. They hadn't expected to be caught so quickly. Not only were they recognized, but they were already wanted for other crimes. When the officers searched the vehicles, the men were arrested on the spot, charged for the weapons they carried and more. Hearing that changed the air among us again. The tension eased, but it didn't vanish. Knowing who they were, what they had done before, and what they might have done that day if we hadn't been prepared left a heavy mark. We sat in the canyon a long while, not shooting, not laughing, just letting the reality sink in. I remember looking at the kids most of all. Their faces were serious, older somehow than they had been that morning. For them, it had been more than just target practice or camping in the desert. It was proof of what we had all been taught from the start. Out there, with no help close by, it was only us. And that day, being ready made the difference between watching trucks drive away and facing something far worse. When we finally packed everything and headed out, the desert looked different. The same sun, the same canyon walls, but under the dust and silence there was a sharp edge I couldn't shake. Even now, when I think back to it, the sound I hear most isn't the gunfire echoing off the rock. It's the silence, heavy and unbroken. When two trucks full of armed men realized they had walked into a family who wasn't going to be an easy target. And for once, that silence was enough to send them running. The first time I took my wife, who was only my girlfriend back then, out backpacking, I thought it would be a simple introduction. I wanted her to see why I loved being out there, why carrying everything on your back and disappearing into the woods for a few days gave me a kind of peace I couldn't find anywhere else. I planned it so we'd go in early spring, before the trails got crowded and before the heat of summer made it harder. The air was still cold, the ground damp from melting snow, and the trees were just starting to wake up. The trail was quiet that day, no other hikers in sight. We started off early in the morning, and within the first mile I noticed cougar tracks pressed into the soft dirt. At first I thought nothing of it. I had seen prints before, usually faded or washed down from rain. But as we kept going, the tracks stayed on the trail, clean and sharp, like they had been pressed in not too long ago. My wife wasn't used to noticing details like that, so I kept it to myself. I just scanned the edges of the trees a little more often, listened a little harder for movement off the trail. Every step we took, the prints went ahead of us, always leading forward. Sometimes they cut off into the brush, then reappeared farther up. It was hard to tell how fresh they were, but the size was unmistakable. Big pads, claws barely showing. A mature cat, not some youngster. My wife walked ahead of me most of the time, her pack swaying slightly, her ponytail brushing the collar of her jacket. She was happy, pointing out birds and small flowers pushing up through the wet soil, while I kept my eyes moving, measuring the tracks against the size of my boot. By the time we picked a spot to set up camp, I had convinced myself the prints were old. Maybe days old, maybe longer. The weather had been shifting a lot, rain one day, sun the next, and tracks could last longer than you'd think if conditions lined up. We found a small flat area a few hundred yards off the trail, close enough to a stream that we could get water, but far enough away that we wouldn't hear the running all night. The trees gave us some cover, and the ground was soft enough to stake the tent without fighting rocks or roots. The rain started up not long after we cooked dinner. It was a steady spring rain, soft but enough to drum on the tent fly. We crawled into our bags, the air damp and cool but not freezing. I fell asleep to the sound of the rain and the smell of wet earth, with her breathing steady next to me. Nothing seemed wrong. Felt like a perfect night. When I unzipped the tent in the morning, I froze. The ground outside looked like it had been walked over by an army. Every inch of soil around the tent was covered in cougar tracks. They weren't scattered or random. They circled us, pressed deep where the ground was soft. The rain had washed away all our own prints, so the only thing left were the cats. I saw where it had stepped close to the tent walls, right where our heads had been when we were sleeping. The soil was pressed down deeper there, as if it had stood for a while, sniffing. I crouched low and followed the impressions with my eyes, tracing the way it had moved around us, slow and deliberate. I didn't say much to her. I just pointed at the ground, and she understood immediately. Her face went pale, and she zipped the tent shut behind us like that would do anything. We didn't eat breakfast there. We packed fast, stuffed everything into our bags, and within 20 minutes we were moving back down the trail. And the prints followed us. The same pair, heading the same direction we were. They led all the way back toward the car, appearing and disappearing along the path, but always there, always just far enough ahead that I knew we weren't alone. The hair on the back of my neck stayed up the whole hike out. We never heard a branch snap, never caught a glimpse of a tail or movement in the brush, but I knew it had been there, watching, probably hungry, probably sizing us up through the thin nylon of the tent. That was her first backpacking trip. Not exactly the kind of memory I had planned for her, but she stuck with me. She even came out again, though I could tell that night left a mark on her. Couldn't blame her. Years later, we went back to that same area. By then, she was my wife and we had more experience under our belts. We both carried pistols on trips, though I had never once needed to touch mine except for target practice. The woods still made me nervous, but not in the way people think. It wasn't the animals. It was the people who could show up in places like that, the ones who had no reason to be out there. But animals still reminded you quick who really owned the woods. We were hiking a long stretch of trail when we spotted movement just off to the side. 2 black bear cubs tumbled around a tree, climbing up and down like kids on a playground. They were small, maybe the size of a medium dog, and at first it was almost funny watching them scramble. But there was no sign of their mother. I felt my chest tighten as soon as I realized. Cubs never stray far from their mom. If they were here, she had to be close, maybe even watching us right then. My wife froze, her eyes wide, and I whispered for her to keep moving. I slipped my revolver from its holster, not waving it around, just holding it low and ready. We started walking again, talking in calm voices so the bears would know we were there, so nothing about us seemed like a threat. I let her take the lead so I could watch her and the trail at the same time. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement across from us. The mother was there, in the trees on the opposite side of the trail, just standing still. That was when it hit me, we were right between her and her cubs. Exactly the worst place you can be. I felt my stomach drop, but we kept our pace steady, boots pressing into the damp dirt one after another. We didn't run, didn't stop, didn't even look at her too long. Just walked, voices carrying low and even. My hands stayed tight on the pistol grip, every sense screaming at me to be ready for her to charge. But she didn't. She just stood there, dark and solid in the shadows, watching as we passed. The cubs stayed on their side of the trail, bouncing up and down the tree trunk like they hadn't even noticed what was happening. When we were far enough ahead, I holstered the revolver, though my hand stayed close. Only when the trail curved and I couldn't see them anymore did I let myself breathe fully. My wife turned and gave me a look that said everything: relief, fear, disbelief that it had gone so smoothly. We didn't stop walking until we were miles down the trail. We made it out fine, but that moment stayed burned into me just like the cougar tracks had years before. You think you know how you'll act when you come face to face with something like that, but when it happens you realize how thin the line is. Out there, you're never the one in control, no matter how much gear you bring or how prepared you feel. We still backpack together, but those 2 trips were the ones that always come back to me when I'm lying awake at night in a tent. Not because anything terrible happened, but because both times we came close, closer than most people ever will, to finding out how quickly things can go bad. We were lucky, plain and simple. The cougar wasn't hungry enough. The bear decided not to push it, and we kept moving step by step until we were out of their world and back in our own. That's the thing about the woods. You don't need ghosts or legends to make them terrifying. The animals are real enough, and so is the silence that follows you home. I had never been the type to get scared easily when camping. I grew up outdoors, spent a lot of time fishing, hiking, and staying out overnight in the woods. I knew the difference between the normal noises of animals and the things people often let their imaginations run wild with. But what happened to me almost 2 years ago up at Mary's Peak, just outside Corvallis, Oregon, stuck with me in a way nothing else ever had. It wasn't anything supernatural. It wasn't a ghost or some kind of folklore story. It was people, and that was far worse because people can be unpredictable and dangerous in ways animals and weather can't. I was out there with my girlfriend. We had planned just a simple car camping night. Nothing complicated. We drove up in the afternoon, found a nice overlook that faced a wide valley, and parked the car in a flat spot just off the gravel road. It was a good place to set up, high enough to have a view and far enough from town that we figured no one else would bother coming around that late. The sun had set behind the trees, and by the time night settled in, we were just sitting inside the car, reclining the seats, listening to music quietly on my phone speaker, and drinking a couple beers. It was one of those nights where everything felt peaceful and simple. The car was warm from the day, the air outside was cool, and we could see the faint outlines of the mountains against the night sky. The inside of the car fogged up pretty quickly. We had the windows up most of the way, and between our breathing, the beers, and the small battery-powered lantern I had clipped inside, the windows were hazy. It was obvious if anyone came by that the car wasn't abandoned. We weren't hidden. Around 10 o'clock, maybe a little after, I saw headlights sweep up the road from behind us. It wasn't unusual to see a car out there, but this was more than just one. A whole line of trucks came rolling up. At least 3, maybe 4. Big ones, too. Loud engines, lifted suspensions, new-looking. They pulled up close to where we were parked and stopped just 10 feet away. A group of guys climbed out. From where I sat, I could see their silhouettes through the misted glass, moving around the overlook. They stood there for a bit, just looking out into the valley, talking among themselves. I couldn't hear much of what they said, but their voices carried in the cold night air. My girlfriend was tense beside me, and I remember the feeling of that silence in the car, both of us waiting for them to either leave or notice us. But they didn't bother us directly. After a couple minutes, they got back in their trucks, engines roaring, and drove down the road, farther past us. We exchanged a nervous glance but shrugged it off. It wasn't our overlook. Anyone could drive up there. Still, something about the way they pulled in so close unsettled me. It was just the 2 of us in the middle of nowhere, and that group had been bigger and louder than anything we expected. We tried to settle back down, tried to convince ourselves it was nothing. About half an hour later, maybe closer to 45 minutes, we were lying back, ready to try and sleep. That's when I saw the lights again. Multiple sets of headlights, bright and fast, cutting through the trees behind us. My stomach dropped immediately. The trucks came barreling back up the same road, faster this time, and stopped abruptly, maybe 20 or 30 feet away from our car. They didn't get out right away. The engine stayed on, exhaust rumbling low, headlights cutting through the night and making the fog on our windows glow. We just sat there frozen, watching through tiny clear patches on the glass. Minutes passed. I could feel the weight of the adrenaline in my chest, like my body was telling me something bad was about to happen. Then, almost at the same time, all the doors swung open and the guys jumped out. This time, it wasn't just standing around looking at the valley. They had rifles and pistols in their hands, and without a word, they started running down the dead-end road in the opposite direction of where we were parked, firing into the darkness. The sharp cracks of gunfire echoed off the trees, one after another, a mix of rifle shots and the faster pops of pistols. The sound was so sudden and violent that it felt like it was right next to us, even though they weren't aiming at us. I could feel my girlfriend shaking next to me. We were both drunk, not sloppy but buzzed enough to feel it. All our gear was in the car, food, sleeping bags, everything. I didn't even think about packing up. My only thought was getting the hell out of there before those guys decided to turn their attention on us. I scrambled over into the driver's seat, barely dressed, just in my underwear, heart pounding so hard I could hear it over the gunfire. I turned the key and floored it, gravel spitting under the tires as we shot back down the road in the opposite direction. The whole way out, I kept waiting to see headlights in the rearview mirror, expecting them to chase us. Every bend in the road felt like it would reveal one of those trucks. My girlfriend was twisted around in her seat, staring back through the fogged glass, ready to tell me if they were coming. But no one followed. The gunfire faded as the distance grew, until it was only the sound of my engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. I didn't want to risk getting back onto the main road. I had been drinking, and the last thing I wanted was a DUI on top of everything else. So I drove deeper into the forest roads, bouncing along in the dark, trying to put as much space as I could between us and those guys. After about half an hour, I found another turnout I recognized from past trips and pulled in. We shut off the car, sat in silence, both of us wide-eyed, still running on adrenaline. Sleep was impossible. Every sound outside, the wind in the trees, a branch snapping somewhere in the distance, made us jump. We stayed like that until the sky started to lighten, until it was finally safe to drive back without worrying about cops or those trucks being around. When we finally returned to the original spot the next morning, the overlook looked completely different in daylight. Scattered across the ground were dozens of empty White Claw cans, crushed and tossed everywhere. Mixed in with them were shell casings, pistol rounds, rifle rounds all over the gravel. It was a mess, like some drunken shooting party had taken over the quiet overlook we thought would be peaceful. Standing there, sober and exhausted, looking at all that trash and spent ammunition, the reality of it sank in deeper. It wasn't just that we had run into some loud group of college kids. These were people with expensive trucks, plenty of money to blow on booze and ammo, out there in the woods acting reckless with weapons, not caring who else might be nearby. They didn't know we were sitting there in the car, or maybe they did and didn't care. But either way, we were caught in the middle of it. If they had decided to turn their drunken target practice in our direction, there would have been nothing we could have done. I had never thought about owning a gun before. I never saw the need. But standing there, remembering how exposed we felt in that car, how powerless, it was the first time in my life I understood why people carry one when they go into the wilderness. Out there, it isn't always bears or cougars you need to worry about. Sometimes it's the people. We left the overlook quickly after that, didn't stick around to enjoy the view again. Even now, every time I think about heading out car camping in a remote spot, I remember that night, the sound of those gunshots in the dark, the headlights cutting through the trees, the way my chest felt like it was caving in from fear. And the worst part is knowing it wasn't some rare, impossible event. It was just a group of drunk guys with too much firepower and not enough sense, and we happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It taught me something I'll never forget. The woods can be beautiful, peaceful, even healing, but they're never empty. You're never as alone as you think. I had never thought much about how exposed a tent really is until that night at Canyon de Chelly. It was almost 20 years ago, but I can still remember every single detail like it happened last night. We were camping in one of the public campgrounds inside the park, the kind of place where you expect to feel safe because there are other people around. There were cars parked, tents set up everywhere, campfires glowing, voices carrying across the grounds. It felt more like a neighborhood cookout than a remote camping spot. That sense of safety was the only reason I even agreed to sleep in the ultralight tent I had brought. It was one of those with a full mesh top and a rain fly you could pull over if needed. That night was warm and clear, so I had left the fly off, which meant the entire roof and half the sides were see-through. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I liked the idea of falling asleep under the stars, but later I realized how vulnerable it made me. It was sometime late in the evening, though not too late, because I remember hearing other campers still talking and moving around. I woke up suddenly because I heard footsteps right next to the tent. At first I thought it was a deer. The steps were heavy enough that they were definitely close, crunching softly in the dirt and gravel. My body tensed up, and I held my breath, waiting to hear if it would wander off. Instead, the sound stopped right next to me. I turned my head slightly and saw a shadow above me, a figure standing over the tent, looking down through the mesh roof straight at me. My heart shot up into my throat. I blurted out, "Hey!" And the figure turned quickly and walked away without saying a word. The way he moved wasn't like someone startled by accident. It was quick and deliberate, like he knew he wasn't supposed to be there and needed to disappear. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, yanked on some clothes, and told my partner at the time that some guy had just been standing over the tent looking in. He was half asleep and just muttered something about it not being a big deal, probably a drunk camper, and rolled back over. That reaction frustrated me, but it also left me with no sense of safety. I couldn't go back to sleep after that. The thought of someone walking up and peering down at me while I lay helpless on the ground was too much. I left the tent and sat in the car, locking the doors, trying to calm myself down. The campground was still active, a couple of fires glowing, the distant sound of laughter. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that if anything serious was going on, someone else would notice. But sitting there, watching the shadows move between the campsites, I started to get the creeping feeling that I wasn't imagining it. Every time I looked toward the tree line behind our site, I thought I saw movement. At one point I froze because I swore I saw someone crouching or creeping near the back edge of the site, moving low, almost like they were sneaking closer to the tent. My stomach dropped. I stayed in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel, leaning forward to see better. The figure got closer, slowly, carefully, and then just as it reached the edge of the tent, it stopped and walked away quickly. No sound, no words, just that same deliberate movement. I rushed back to the tent and tried to wake my partner again, but he brushed me off. He said I was imagining things and he wasn't going to get up. That left me completely on my own. I didn't want to sit inside the tent again. It felt like nothing more than a thin bag on the ground. So I went back to the car, locked the doors, and sat in silence, trying to decide what to do. Not long after, I noticed a man walking down the road that cut through the campground. He wasn't staggering like a drunk, and he didn't seem like he was heading to or from a campsite. He just walked slowly, deliberately, down the middle of the gravel road. When he got even with where I was parked, he suddenly raised a flashlight and aimed it straight into my face through the windshield. The light was blinding. He held it there for a couple of seconds, long enough that it didn't feel accidental, long enough that my skin crawled and my body froze. I couldn't see his face behind the beam. When he finally lowered the light and kept walking, I sat there frozen, my chest tight, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard that my knuckles hurt. That moment was the worst. I didn't know if he was the same person who had been circling the tent earlier or if there were more than one person out there. I only knew that whoever it was, they weren't just lost or confused. They were playing some kind of game, and I was the target. I jumped out of the car and started shouting for my partner, my voice carrying across the campground. I didn't care anymore about waking people up. I told him we needed to get out of there right then. He dragged himself up, annoyed, but when he saw how panicked I was, he didn't argue. We threw everything into the car, barely folding or packing anything, just stuffing it all in the back seat and trunk. The entire time I felt like eyes were on us. Every shadow, Every movement in the dark made me jerk my head. I couldn't tell where the man with the flashlight had gone. We drove out of the campground, my heart pounding, checking the mirrors constantly. The road wound out of the park, and every car we passed made me tense, half expecting someone to follow us. Eventually, we stopped at a Howard Johnson off the highway. I remember the glow of the neon sign, the comfort of being near other people, even if it was just strangers coming and going from the motel. From there, we tried calling the Rangers, then the non-emergency police line, then tribal police. None of them seemed interested or helpful. They told us to call back during business hours or brushed it off as nothing. That sense of helplessness added to the unease, because I realized even if something had happened, there was nobody who was going to come rushing in to help. We ended up driving a little farther and pulling off on the side of the road to sleep in the car. I didn't really sleep. Every sound outside made me sit up, peering into the dark, gripping the steering wheel like I could take off at any second. My partner eventually drifted off, but I sat there most of the night, wired, waiting for morning. When the sun finally came up, we were near Monument Valley. I stepped out of the car, stiff and exhausted, but then I looked up and saw it. The red plateaus glowing in the sunrise, the full moon still hanging pale in the west. It was one of the most beautiful sights I have ever seen. The fear of the night before didn't vanish, but it felt distant, like something that had happened in another world. Even now, 2 decades later, I think about that night often. What still gets me is how ordinary everything seemed at first. The campground was busy. There were people awake, voices carrying, laughter nearby. It felt safe because it was public. That was the most unsettling part. Someone could still creep around, watch us, walk right up to our tent, even shine a light directly into my face, and no one else seemed to notice or care. If we had been more secluded, I think we would have left immediately. But being surrounded by people lulled me into waiting too long. I never used that ultralight tent again. I never camped without a rainfly, and I never slept in a public campground without keeping the car close enough to jump into. That night taught me how thin the line is between safety and exposure, and how easily someone with bad intentions can cross it without anyone else noticing. It's something I'll never forget. I grew up in Arkansas, and I've always loved camping, especially in the Ozarks. Most people who spend their weekends in cabins or campgrounds don't really know what it's like when things actually go wrong out there. It's not always just about sitting by a fire and roasting hot dogs. I've had some trips that went smooth, but I've also had some that still stick in my head when I think about them at night. Some were weather-related, some involved animals, and others were people. People are the ones that still bother me the most. The first time things went bad was near Salem, at a spot that used to be a music festival ground years ago before the government bought it. The land there is wide open in some parts, with woods on the edges, and when it rains it can get ugly fast. I had set up my tent in early spring. The air was cool, and it had been cloudy most of the day, but nothing looked dangerous. I pitched my tent a little higher than the lowest parts of the field, or so I thought, and set up my little stove to cook. I remember listening to the frogs that night and feeling pretty relaxed. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up to a strange noise. It was rushing water. At first, I thought it was just rain on the tent, but then I realized the ground under my sleeping bag felt soft and shifting. I unzipped the tent and found water already pooling around me. It wasn't slow either, it was rising by the second. By the time I shoved my boots on, water was almost waist deep. The whole open field had turned into a moving sheet of water. I had seconds to grab my pack and scramble. The current was pushing against my legs so hard I could barely keep my footing. My tent, my gear, everything I hadn't grabbed was swallowed up. I managed to fight my way to higher ground, soaked to the bone, my heart hammering. I sat under a tree and just watched as the whole place turned into a river. If I had stayed in my sleeping bag even 10 more minutes, I don't think I'd be here. That was the first time I realized how fast nature can shift. You think you're safe, but you're not. A year later, I went back to the same area, but on the other side of it. This time, it wasn't sudden flooding, but I still got trapped. There's a bridge you normally use to cross the creek, but after days of steady rain, The bridge washed out completely. The water was violent, carrying branches, foam, and mud. I had food, but not much and no way to get across without risking my life. I ended up having to sit there for 2 full days, waiting for the water to drop. I spent the days cold, damp, and anxious, rationing what little I had left. Every time I went near the water's edge, I could hear it roaring and chewing away at the banks. It made me feel small and powerless, stuck on one side with no choice but to wait. By the time I finally crossed, I felt like I'd aged a year. But animals can make you feel just as small. One night in the Ozarks, near Blanchard Springs, I woke up to the sound of heavy breathing outside my tent. At first, I thought maybe it was a deer. I stayed quiet, trying not to move. Then I heard the shuffle of something heavy and the snapping of a branch that only something strong could break. I peeked through a little tear in my tent fabric, and that's when I saw the dark shape. A bear. It wasn't huge, but big enough to end me if it wanted. It was sniffing around the fire pit, probably smelling the food I'd cooked earlier. I sat completely still, every muscle frozen. I could hear it huffing and dragging its claws on the ground. It circled my tent, close enough that I could see its shadow moving across the thin fabric. I thought it was going to tear right through. The only thing that saved me was that I hadn't left any food inside the tent. After a while, it wandered off, crashing through the trees. I didn't sleep again that night, not 1 second. I just sat up. Clutching my knife like that would have made a difference. As bad as floods and bears are, though, the scariest moment I've ever had camping wasn't from nature. It was from a person. This was in Texas at a public campground. I had pulled in late, set up my small tent, and kept to myself. There were a few other campers around, but spread out enough to feel quiet. I went to bed not thinking much of it. Sometime in the night, I woke up to footsteps, not just passing by, but deliberate, slow steps circling my tent. My chest tightened instantly. The steps stopped right outside, close enough that whoever it was could have bent down and touched the fabric. I didn't move. I listened. After a few minutes, I heard the sound of someone breathing. Not an animal, this was steady, human. Then there was the faint scrape of a boot on gravel. I lay there, my heart hammering in my ears, waiting for the zipper to move. I don't know how long it went on, but it felt like forever. Finally, the steps moved away. I knew right then that I wasn't staying another minute. I lit my lantern, grabbed my pack, and did the fastest teardown of a campsite I've ever done in my life. I didn't even care about folding things or packing them right. I shoved my tent in the back of the car half unrolled, tossed in my gear, and drove out of there. When I finally got back on the highway, I realized my hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the wheel. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted. Maybe he was just curious, maybe not. But the way he moved, slow, deliberate, breathing outside my tent like that, he wasn't just passing through. He was standing there, watching. That was enough for me. All of those trips taught me something. Floods, rivers, bears, they're dangerous, but they're just nature doing what it does. You respect it, prepare for it, and sometimes you still get caught off guard. But people are different. When someone shows up in the dark and circles your tent, you can't read their intentions, and that's worse. Because nature doesn't decide to hurt you for fun.
A Person kennen.
After that night in Texas, I camp differently. I stay alert, I choose my spots more carefully, and I trust my gut. If something feels off, I don't try to tough it out anymore. I've had close calls with water, close calls with animals, but nothing made me pack up and leave as fast as that man did. And between storms, bears, and floods, it's the thought of him standing outside my tent that still creeps back when I try to sleep out there under the trees.